A man lies dying in a rented room in Greenwich Village, New York, in the summer of 1809, and almost nobody cares. He is 72 years old. His body has been failing for months. Strokes, fevers, a weakness in his legs that makes standing difficult. A few neighbours check in occasionally. A handful of former acquaintances stop by out of obligation. But the room itself is modest to the point of bleakness. The kind of rented space a man ends up in when he has no money, no property, no one left who feels compelled to do better by him. His name is Thomas Paine. If you had said that name aloud in Philadelphia in 1776, every person within earshot would have known it instantly. 33 years earlier, this same man had written a pamphlet, 47 pages, published on January 10th, 1776, signed only as by an Englishman. Within 3 months, by Paine's own estimate, it had sold 100,000 copies among a colonial population of 2 million. By the end of the Revolution, the total count reached something close to 500,000. George Washington ordered it read aloud to his troops before they crossed the Delaware River in December of that year. John Adams said, without it, Washington's sword would have been raised in vain. The pamphlet was called Common Sense. It did something no legislative debate had managed. It convinced ordinary people that independence wasn't just possible. It convinced them it was obvious. That man is now dying in a rented room, and 6 people will attend his funeral. How does that happen? How does the most widely read political writer in the English-speaking world end up despised by the very country his words helped create? It's not a simple story. It doesn't have a clean villain or a single turning point. It has 3 decades of decisions, each one made out of the same fierce conviction that made common sense so powerful, each one costing him something he couldn't get back. Paine had helped ignite the American Revolution with his pen. He had then crossed to France and written a book defending the French Revolution that sold 1 million copies across Europe and got him charged with seditious libel in Britain. He had been imprisoned in Paris during the Terror, had come within a door's width of the guillotine, had spent nearly 11 months in the Luxembourg prison, watching fellow prisoners dragged out to their executions while he burned with fever. He had written, during that imprisonment, a book attacking organised religion. Not God, Paine was careful to say, but churches, priests, scripture, and the entire machinery of institutional faith. That book, The Age of Reason, was the one that finished him in America. Churches denounced him from the pulpit. Newspapers called him a filthy atheist. When he returned to the United States in 1802, he was spat upon in the streets. Thomas Jefferson, who genuinely admired him, kept his distance in public. Paine had become a political liability. He tried to vote in New Rochelle and was turned away. He tried to secure a pension for his revolutionary service and was refused. He spent his last years moving between rented rooms and the small farm New York State had given him, drinking more than was good for him, writing pieces that fewer and fewer people bothered to read. The man who had once shaped the thinking of a continent was ignored. This is what makes Paine's story genuinely strange. It wasn't that the world failed to notice him. The world noticed him enormously. He was celebrated across 2 continents. He was elected to the French National Convention by 3 separate departments, despite not speaking French. His words were quoted by soldiers, read aloud in taverns, translated into German and Danish. He was arguably the most consequential political writer of the 18th century in the English language. He died in poverty, refused burial in a Quaker graveyard because he had spent 30 years criticising organised religion, laid into the ground of his New Rochelle farm with 6 mourners present. The Quakers had been his father's faith. The farm was a gift. The room where he died was rented. He owned almost nothing else. What you are about to hear is the complete life of a man who helped make the modern world and was then largely discarded by it. A man born into a Norfolk market town with no prospects, who failed at nearly every trade he attempted before accidentally discovering, at 37, that he could write in a way that made revolutions feel inevitable. The man who gave revolutions their words died without a country willing to claim him. The story of how that happened is stranger than almost anything he ever wrote. Thetford, Norfolk, was the kind of English market town where the same families had lived on the same streets for generations, where nothing particularly surprising was expected to happen. Where, on January 29th, 1737, Thomas Paine was born. The town itself was ancient, quiet, and entirely unremarkable. It sat in the flat heathland of East Anglia, surrounded by fields and sky. It had been producing the same modest things for centuries: wool, grain, local commerce, without producing much else. The population was small, the social hierarchies were fixed. A corset maker's son was a corset maker's son. That was more or less where the story ended. How does a place like that produce a man who helps ignite 2 revolutions on 2 continents? The answer begins, as it usually does, not with the town itself but with the household inside it. Thomas Paine's father was Joseph Paine, a Quaker. His mother was Frances Cock, an Anglican whose family occupied a considerably higher station than Joseph's. That gap mattered. In 18th century England, marrying across religious lines was not done casually. It created friction with neighbours, friction with institutions, friction inside the home itself. The Anglican Church was the established church. It ran the schools, blessed the courts, sat comfortably at the centre of English life. The Quakers were something else entirely. They refused to pay tithes to the Anglican Church. They declined to use titles of nobility. They would not doff their hats to men of rank. They addressed everyone as equals. That, in a society built on the careful performance of deference, struck the ruling classes as somewhere between eccentric and dangerous. The Quakers believed, simply, stubbornly, that all human beings were equal before God. They behaved accordingly, which made them socially marginal almost by design. Joseph Paine was not a wealthy man. His craft, making stays for corsets, provided enough to live on, and not much more. The family occupied the modest end of Thetford's modest social spectrum. Frances's Anglican background gave the household a small degree of respectability, but it also created a constant undercurrent of religious tension. Here was a child who heard one parent's tradition tell him that the church was the backbone of civilization. Another parent's tradition tell him, by example, if not always by words. That hierarchy was something to be questioned rather than simply accepted. That particular combination would take decades to become anything visible, but it was working on him from the beginning. Paine had one sibling, a sister, who died in infancy. He grew up then, essentially alone. The only child in a house caught between 2 worlds, with no brother to compete with. No sister to confide in. Just his parents, and the quiet contradiction their marriage represented. What that kind of childhood produces, sometimes, is a child who watches and thinks more than he plays. There's no reliable record of Paine being particularly sickly, unlike Locke. Unlike so many other children of the period, who spent their early years too ill to do much else. He seems to have been reasonably healthy, reasonably quiet, observant in the way that only children often are. At 7 or 8, he began attending Thetford Grammar School. The school sat near the town centre and was exactly what the name suggested. A grammar school, in the Old English sense, meaning it taught Latin alongside the basics. Though for children from working families, the Latin was often the first thing dropped in favour of more practical instruction. Paine received reading, writing and arithmetic. He learned enough Latin to know it existed, but not enough to use it comfortably. That would later become one of the most important facts about him as a writer. He was not trained in the classical rhetorical tradition. He could not gesture at Cicero to lend authority to an argument. He had to make his arguments in plain language or not at all. This was a limitation that became, in time, a diva, stating advantage. The school itself was unremarkable, the instruction probably adequate for a boy expected to enter a trade. What it gave him was literacy, and literacy in that period was not nothing. A man who could read and write clearly, who could follow an argument on a page and construct one in return, had a tool that most working-class Englishmen simply didn't possess. Paine possessed it. He also possessed something harder to quantify, a sense absorbed from his father's Quaker community, that the men who ran things were not necessarily the men who deserved to run things, that titles and ranks and inherited authority were conventions, not natural laws. That the distance between a nobleman and a corset maker was a human invention, not a divine one. He couldn't have articulated it that way at 13. He was a child from a market town, with a grammar school education, and a father who made stays for women's undergarments. The revolutionary pamphleteer, the man whose words Washington would order, read to a freezing army. The writer who would sell 500,000 copies of a single document. None of that was even imaginable yet. He left school at 13 with a basic education, a suspicion of religious authority he couldn't yet name. No obvious prospects whatsoever. The years between Paine leaving school and arriving in America are largely a story of things going wrong. He was 13 years old when he left a Thetford grammar school, and the path in front of him was obvious and narrow. His father made corsets. That was the trade available to him. So Paine began his apprenticeship in the workshop, learning how to cut and stitch and shape the stays that held together the fashionable women of 18th century England. It was skilled work in its way. It was also suffocating. Paine was 16 when he decided he had had enough of it. What he wanted instead was the sea. Specifically, he wanted to sign on to a privateer called the Terrible, commanded by a captain named Death, which was either a magnificent coincidence or a detail too perfect to entirely trust. His father stopped him. The elder Joseph Paine seems to have understood something his son didn't, that life at sea in wartime, aboard a ship of that kind, was not adventure. It was a fast route to a slow death. Paine accepted this reluctantly. He went back to the corsets, but the ambition didn't disappear. At 19, with rather less interference from his father, he served briefly aboard another privateer, the King of Prussia, getting what the sea had to offer. What it offered, it turned out, was discomfort, and not much else. He returned to England without glory, without money, without any obvious improvement in his circumstances. He had satisfied whatever curiosity he had about naval life, and found the reality considerably less romantic than the idea, so he tried to make a go of it as a staymaker. He opened his own shop in Sandwich, Kent, which required both capital he barely had, and optimism he seems to have sustained, almost through force of will. The shop failed. This was not a brief setback that taught him resilience. It was a straightforward collapse, the kind that left debts behind and forced him to move on. He drifted to London for a time, then to other towns, picking up work where he could find it, which was not always easy and never particularly dignified. He married during these years. Her name was Mary Lambert, and almost nothing about her survives except the fact of her death. She died in childbirth within a year of the marriage, along with the child. Paine was in his early 20s, alone again, and without even the modest foothold of a household to anchor him. He kept moving. This is the texture of these years. A man going from one town to the next, trying things and watching them not work, accumulating a very thorough education in how English society treated people without connections, without university degrees, without the right family names or the right kind of money. The England Paine moved through was not kind to men in his position. It was a country of rigid hierarchies, and the distance between a corset maker's son from Norfolk and the people who made real decisions was essentially unbridgeable. You could work hard, you could be intelligent. Neither of those things reliably got you anywhere without someone of consequence willing to vouch for you. Paine had no one like that. What he had was restlessness and a mind that kept working on problems larger than the ones directly in front of him. Eventually, he found his way into the excise service. This meant becoming a tax collector, hunting smugglers, keeping accounts of taxable goods, extracting revenue from people who had little desire to give it. The work was poorly paid and socially marginal. Excise officers occupied an uncomfortable position in English life. They were government employees, which should have meant respectability, but the nature of the job meant they were often resented by the communities they worked in and looked down upon by the classes above them. The pay was low enough that Paine would later write, with some feeling, about the impossibility of living decently on what the excise service offered. He was not describing abstract grievance. He was describing his own situation. He was dismissed from the excise once, reinstated, and would eventually be dismissed again. The pattern was already visible. Every time something seemed to be working, something else came undone. He couldn't stay in one place. The jobs didn't hold. The enterprises collapsed. There was nothing catastrophic about any individual failure. No single disaster that explained his trajectory. It was simply that nothing quite worked, and the years kept passing, and the life he was living was not the life his intelligence suggested he was capable of. By his mid-30s, he had failed as a craftsman, failed as a husband, failed as a sailor, and was now failing, slowly but thoroughly, as a government tax collector. Lewes was a small Sussex town perched on chalk hills near the Channel coast. It was here, in his mid-30s, that Thomas Paine began to figure out what he was actually for. He'd been posted there as an excise officer in 1768, his second attempt at the job after being dismissed the first time. The work was unglamorous. He hunted smugglers along the Sussex coast, collected taxes on liquor and tobacco, kept ledgers, filed reports, answered to superiors who had no particular interest in the opinions of a man in his position. But Lewes was different from the places he'd drifted through before. It had a civic culture, debating clubs, reading groups, men who argued seriously about ideas in the evenings after work. Paine joined the Headstrong Club, a local debating society that met at the White Hart Inn. For the first time in his life, he found himself in a room where his mind was actually useful. He read voraciously, he argued, he began to understand that he could make a case. The marriage to Elizabeth Olive came in 1771. She was the daughter of his landlord, a tobacconist named Samuel Olive, who had died and left the family in difficulty. The arrangement appears to have been practical on both sides. There's little evidence it was a love match. They separated in 1774 and apparently agreed to live as though the marriage had never existed. Paine never spoke of her much afterward, and she never spoke publicly of him. Whatever the marriage was, it wasn't the thing that defined his years in Lewes. What defined those years was the slow, steady accumulation of grievance. As an excise officer, Paine saw how the system actually worked from the inside. The men who held these positions were paid a poverty wage. They were expected to cover large territories on their own, maintain their own horses, absorb costs that their salaries couldn't support. Corruption was almost inevitable, not because excise officers were bad men, but because the structure made honest work nearly impossible. Paine looked at this and saw something he'd seen everywhere since childhood. A system designed by people who had money treating people who didn't have money, as though their difficulties were their own fault. In 1772, he decided to write about it. Case of the Officers of Excise was a short, lucid pamphlet arguing that excise officers deserved higher wages, that the current pay scale bred the very corruption the Crown complained about, that the men who enforced the tax laws of England were being asked to do the impossible for nothing. It was not a radical document. It was not calling for revolution. It was a measured, careful argument addressed to people with the power to change something specific. Paine had 4,000 copies printed. He spent the winter of 1772 and into 1773 in London, distributing them to members of Parliament, lobbying anyone who would speak to him, spending money he didn't have on the project. He went into debt. He neglected his excise duties. He believed, apparently with some sincerity, that a well-reasoned argument placed in front of the right people would produce results. Parliament ignored it completely. Not rejected it, not debated it, ignored it. The pamphlet was read by almost no one who mattered, discussed by fewer still, produced not a single change in excise officer pay. Paine returned to Lewes having accomplished nothing except the thorough demonstration that the political system had no interest in the grievances of ordinary men. However carefully those grievances were explained, the consequences came quickly. He'd neglected his post during the London lobbying trip. In 1774, he was dismissed from the excise service. The marriage to Elizabeth Olive dissolved around the same time. The shop her family had run went too. In a matter of months, the modest life he'd assembled in Lewes simply ceased to exist. He was left with debts, no employment. One thing he hadn't possessed in quite the same way before, a precise and personal understanding of what it felt like to make a reasonable argument to people in power and be answered with silence. That experience lodged in him. It would come back in everything he later wrote. The contempt for systems that shielded themselves from accountability. The belief that ordinary people deserved a politics that actually listened to them. The fury at institutions that confused their own continuity with legitimate authority. He didn't know any of that yet. In 1774, he was simply a man with nothing left to lose, somewhere around 37 years old, standing in the wreckage of his third attempt at a stable life. He had no job, no wife, no money, no country that seemed to want him, which is precisely when Benjamin Franklin walked into the story. Benjamin Franklin, by 1774, had been watching the conflict between Britain and its American colonies for years. When he met Thomas Paine in London, a recently sacked tax collector with no money and no future, he seems to have recognised something the rest of England had entirely missed. Franklin was 68 years old and had spent the better part of a decade in London as Pennsylvania's colonial agent, trying to convince Parliament that the American grievances over taxation and representation were serious, not theatrical. He'd watched those efforts collapse completely. By 1774, he understood that persuasion had failed, that the gap between Britain and its colonies was no longer a matter of negotiated adjustment, but something deeper and possibly irreparable. He was preparing to go home. What he needed, though he may not have thought of it in these terms, was the right kind of writer on the right side of the Atlantic. Paine reached him through a mutual acquaintance, probably George Lewes Scott, a Fellow of the Royal Society who knew both men. The meeting was brief. Paine was not yet famous for anything. He was 37 years old, recently dismissed from the excise service, freshly separated from his wife, carrying essentially nothing except a set of opinions and an unusual capacity to put them into plain language. Franklin apparently saw enough in that single conversation to offer what amounted to a lifeline. He wrote Paine a letter of recommendation addressed to his son-in-law in Philadelphia. It described Paine as an ingenious, worthy young man. Paine was neither young, nor, by any conventional measure, particularly worthy of anything at that moment. But Franklin had been watching governments and PIE Opal long enough to know the difference between a man with prospects and a man with ability. He'd apparently concluded that Paine had the latter in unusual quantity. Paine booked passage to Philadelphia almost immediately. The crossing took 5 weeks, and it nearly killed him. Typhoid fever broke out aboard the ship somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. Several passengers died. Paine survived, barely, arriving in Philadelphia harbour on November 30th, 1774, so weak that he had to be carried off the ship and taken by carriage rather than walking. He spent the next several weeks in a rented room recovering, cared for by a doctor whose name Franklin had also included in the letter. Philadelphia, in late 1774, was not a city at rest. The First Continental Congress had just concluded its sessions. Delegates from 12 colonies had gathered, argued, issued declarations, and gone home. The question hanging over everything was whether any of it would matter. Most men of property in the city still believed the dispute with Britain could be resolved, that some compromise would emerge, that the trade boycotts and the petitions would eventually produce a reasonable response from Parliament. Paine, lying in a sickbed and reading every newspaper he could obtain, seems to have formed a different assessment almost immediately. Robert Aitken was a Scottish-born printer who had recently arrived in Philadelphia with plans to start a general magazine. He needed an editor. Someone introduced him to Paine, probably through Franklin's letter of recommendation. Within weeks of recovering from the fever, Paine had his first steady employment in America. The Pennsylvania magazine launched in January 1775. Paine threw himself into it with a ferocity that suggests he understood, consciously or not, that he had stumbled into exactly the situation his particular abilities required. He wrote constantly, articles on politics, on natural philosophy, on the condition of working people, on science, on the structure of governments. He wrote most of it anonymously or under pseudonyms, which was standard practice. But the range of what he produced in those first months was remarkable. One early piece, signed only Justice and Humanity, was a direct attack on the African slave trade. It argued that enslaving people was not simply cruel, but fundamentally incompatible with any serious idea of human equality. This was not a common position to publish in an American periodical in 1775. Paine published it anyway. What was becoming clear, both to Paine and to anyone paying attention to what he was writing, was that he had an unusual gift for taking a complicated political or moral argument and stripping it down to its essential logic in language that required no education to follow. He had no Latin, no classical training, none of the ornamental apparatus that educated writers use to signal their seriousness. What he had instead was clarity and a kind of controlled fury at systems he considered indefensible. In Philadelphia, in 1775, those qualities were suddenly worth more than almost anything else a man could bring to a desk. He had arrived in a city on the verge of revolution, could barely stand up from illness, within weeks was writing more clearly about what was happening than almost anyone else. Philadelphia, in 1774 and 1775, was the largest city in British North America and the closest thing the colonies had to a capital, which meant it was also the place where every argument about what to do next was being had most loudly. 30,000 people lived there: printers, merchants, lawyers, dock workers, Quakers, Presbyterians, radicals, loyalists, all of them crowded into a city that was simultaneously prosperous and furious. The streets smelled of commerce and gunpowder politics in roughly equal measure. And into all of this walked Thomas Paine, still recovering from typhoid, 37 years old, with a letter from Benjamin Franklin and nothing else. He found work quickly. Robert Aitken, a Philadelphia printer, was launching a new publication called the Pennsylvania Magazine, and he hired Paine to help shape it. Within weeks, Paine was writing constantly. He covered everything: science, philosophy, maritime affairs, manufacturing, the rights of women, the morality of dueling. Most of it appeared anonymously or under pseudonyms. That was the convention, and Paine had other reasons to be cautious. He was still a newcomer, he had no reputation here, but the volume of what he produced was extraordinary for a man who had only recently been a failed tax collector in Sussex. The piece that stands out is one he signed simply Justice and Humanity. Published in March 1775, it attacked the African slave trade with a directness that had almost no precedent in American print. He called it a traffic in human flesh. He argued that enslaved Africans had every right to resist their captors. He demanded to know how colonists who spoke constantly of liberty could participate in a system that reduced human beings to cargo. It was one of the earliest abolitionist pieces to appear in an American periodical, and it arrived at a moment when almost nobody in public life was willing to go anywhere near the subject. Then April 1775 happened. Lexington, Concord, the first shots. By the time news reached Philadelphia, the city had already been debating colonial rights for years. But debate is different from gunfire, and everyone felt the difference. The Continental Congress was meeting in the city. Delegates from 12 colonies were trying to decide what to do. The mood shifted from argument to something closer, to dread and determination combined. Paine felt it immediately. He moved through the coffee houses and print shops and meeting rooms and absorbed everything he could. What he heard, mostly, was a desire for reconciliation. Most colonists, even angry ones, even ones who had been furious about taxation and trade restrictions for a decade, still framed their grievances in terms of their rights as British subjects. They wanted the king to hear them. They wanted Parliament to back down. They talked about restoring the proper relationship between crown and colony, not dismantling it. Independence was a word most of them avoided. It sounded extreme. It sounded like treason. Paine thought this was entirely the wrong way to see it. He had not grown up inside the empire thinking of himself as a loyal subject waiting to be treated fairly. He had grown up watching what the British system actually did to ordinary people. The poverty it maintained, the hierarchy it enforced, the contempt it showed toward anyone without property or title. He hadn't crossed the Atlantic to restore his rights as an Englishman. He had crossed it because England had offered him nothing, and he had nothing left to lose. That perspective made him see the situation with a clarity that most colonists couldn't quite reach. The problem, as he understood it, wasn't that King George III was a bad king. It was that monarchy itself was an absurd and illegitimate system. Hereditary rule meant that political power was handed down like furniture, generation to generation, regardless of wisdom or fitness or the consent of the people being governed. No negotiation with the existing king could fix that. No petition, no act of parliament, no diplomatic compromise. The only solution was to break away entirely and build something based on reason rather than birthright. This was not a popular position in 1775. It was barely a speakable one. What he was thinking was more dangerous than anything the Continental Congress had yet been willing to say in public, and he sat down and wrote it all out. Common Sense was published on January 10th, 1776, and it was like nothing the colonies had ever read. Paine had been writing it through the autumn of 1775, working in Philadelphia while the first shots of the war were still echoing. Most colonists, even those furious at Parliament, still imagined some kind of reconciliation. They wanted their rights as Englishmen restored. They wanted the king to hear their grievances and act decently. Paine thought this was a fantasy, and he said so bluntly in 47 pages that sold for 2 shillings and were read by anyone who could get hold of a copy. The pamphlet appeared under the name An Englishman. Paine was genuinely afraid of prosecution. Arguing for independence in early 1776 was not merely controversial, it was potentially treasonous. But the anonymity didn't last long. Everyone in Philadelphia seemed to figure out who had written it within weeks, and Paine didn't exactly go out of his way to deny it. Common Sense was organised into 4 sections, and each one did a different kind of damage to the case for staying British. The first attacked the very idea of government by monarchy and hereditary succession. The second examined the English Constitution specifically and argued it was no protection for anyone. The third turned to the immediate situation in America. The fourth made the argument that the colonies were, right now, capable of building something entirely new. Together they formed something that felt less like a political essay and more like a verdict. What Paine did in that first section was genuinely radical. He didn't just argue that George III was a bad king. He argued that kings, as a category, made no sense. Monarchy rested on the idea that one family had been chosen by God or history to rule over everyone else, forever, regardless of ability or character or circumstance. Paine asked a simple question. How did the first king get his position? Either by force, in which case his claim was no more legitimate than any other conqueror's, or by some original election, in which case the principle of popular choice was already there, and there was no reason to abandon it for hereditary succession. The crown passed to sons and nephews and cousins, not because they were suited to rule, but because they happened to be born. A nation that allowed itself to be governed by the accident of birth, Paine wrote, had simply surrendered its own judgment. His attack on hereditary succession was among the sharpest passages in the pamphlet. All men were originally equals, he argued. No man at the beginning of things had any right, by birth alone, to place his family in permanent superiority over all others. The institution of monarchy had no rational foundation. It was a tradition, nothing more. And tradition, however old, was not the same as reason. This was the part that made conservative readers genuinely angry. Paine wasn't asking for better governance within the existing system. He was pulling at the roots of the system itself and asking why anyone had planted it there in the first place. The second section went after the English Constitution, which many colonists still admired and appealed to in their arguments with Parliament. Paine was unimpressed. The Constitution was a patchwork of compromises accumulated over centuries, full of contradictions resting ultimately on the same monarchical logic he had already dismissed. The checks it provided were weak. Parliament could be manipulated by the Crown. The House of Lords was itself a hereditary institution. The whole structure was less a guarantee of liberty than an elaborate justification for concentrating power in the hands of people who had inherited it. By the time Paine reached the third section, the practical case for American independence, he had already done the theoretical work. He wasn't arguing that America should leave the empire because Britain had wronged the colonies, though it had. He was arguing that the entire relationship was misconceived from the start. A continent could not be governed from an island 3,000 miles away. The interests of Britain and the interests of America were not the same, and would never be the same. Every war Britain fought dragged America into it, for reasons that had nothing to do with American welfare. Trade that benefited London came at a cost to Philadelphia. The arrangement made no sense, and the fact that it had persisted made it no more sensible. The fourth section answered the objection that America wasn't ready. Paine ran the numbers. The colonies had population, resources, coastline, timber for ships. They had everything required to sustain an independent republic. What they lacked was not capacity, but will, and common sense was an argument directed precisely at that deficiency. What made the pamphlet so effective, though, was not just the argument, but the language. Paine wrote the way people actually talked. There was no Latin. There were no classical allusions requiring a university education to follow. There were no elaborate periodic sentences that only lawyers could pass. The previous generation of political writing in England and America spoke to educated gentlemen and assumed everyone else would simply defer to their conclusions. Paine addressed the printer's apprentice and the dock worker and the farmer's wife, who might listen while someone read it aloud. He assumed his readers were intelligent. He just didn't assume they had been to Oxford. This was a political choice as much as a stylistic one. If the argument was that all men were equals and that government derived its authority from the consent of ordinary people, then ordinary people had to be able to read and follow the argument themselves. The form matched the content. A pamphlet arguing for popular sovereignty had to be accessible to the people it was asking to be sovereign. Paine also understood the emotional dimension of what he was doing. He wasn't just presenting an analysis, he was trying to change how people felt about their situation, to make them see the connection to Britain not as a natural condition of their existence, but as a specific arrangement that could be ended. He used contempt strategically. He called the king the royal brute of Britain. He described hereditary monarchy as an absurdity dressed up in ceremony. He made loyalty to the crown sound not noble, but naive, the sentiment of people who hadn't yet thought clearly about what they were actually loyal to. The title itself was part of the argument. Common sense, not radical theory, not revolutionary doctrine. The thing any clear-thinking person would conclude if they simply looked at the situation honestly and set aside inherited assumptions. Paine was telling his readers that independence wasn't a dangerous and extreme idea, it was the obvious one. The dangerous and extreme idea was continuing to be governed by a hereditary monarch 3,000 miles away who had already sent troops to kill them. He had taken the most radical political idea of the age, that a people could simply abolish a monarchy and start over, and made it sound obvious. The colonies had never seen anything spread like common sense. Within days of its publication, on January 10th, 1776, copies were moving from hand to hand across Philadelphia. Within weeks, Printers in other cities were producing their own editions without asking anyone's permission. Paine had signed the pamphlet simply by an Englishman, and for a time nobody was entirely sure who had written it. It didn't matter. People were reading it regardless. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. Paine estimated that 100,000 copies sold in the first 3 months alone. The entire colonial population was roughly 2 million people. That proportion, 1 copy for every 20 residents. In an era when books and pamphlets were expensive and literacy was far from universal, it's nearly impossible to imagine today. And 100,000 was just the beginning. By the end of the Revolution, approximately 500,000 copies had circulated, counting the unauthorized reprints that spread far beyond anything Paine could track or control. How does a 47-page pamphlet move like that through a pre-industrial society with no newspapers in the modern sense, no telegraph, no organized distribution network? It moved because people read it aloud, in taverns and meeting houses, in church halls and on village greens. Someone with a copy would read it to everyone who didn't have one. Common Sense was designed for exactly this: the plain language, the short sentences, the arguments that didn't require a university education to follow. Paine had written it to be heard as much as read. The people who heard it were changed by it. That sounds like an exaggeration, but the letters and journals of the period confirm it in striking detail. Colonists who had spent years insisting they only wanted their rights restored as Englishmen within the British Empire suddenly found themselves using a different vocabulary. Independence, republic, a government built from the ground up, answerable to its citizens. These weren't new words, but common sense made them feel possible in a way they simply hadn't before. The arguments Paine had made, that monarchy was absurd on its face, that hereditary rule was a system with no rational justification, that the colonies had nothing to gain and everything to lose by remaining attached to Britain, landed with a force that years of legislative pet itchins had completely failed to produce. The men who would make the decisions were reading it too. George Washington read Common Sense in February 1776 and wrote that it was working a powerful change in the minds of many men. Thomas Jefferson absorbed its arguments thoroughly enough that traces of Paine's phrasing appear in the Declaration of Independence, written 6 months later. John Adams was more ambivalent. He thought Paine's specific proposals for government were dangerously simplistic, but even Adams acknowledged what the pamphlet had accomplished. His verdict was direct. Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. That's a remarkable thing for Adams to have said, given how thoroughly he and Paine would later despise each other. The Second Continental Congress voted for independence on July 2, 1776, approved the final text of the Declaration 2 days after that. Common Sense had appeared in January, 6 months between the pamphlet and the vote. Whether that is a causal relationship or a coincidence is the kind of question historians argue about endlessly, but the timing is at minimum suggestive. Congress had been arguing about reconciliation versus independence for years. What changed in 1776 was not the grievances, those had been building for a decade, but the public appetite for a definitive answer. Common Sense accelerated that appetite dramatically. Paine himself made almost nothing from it. He had declined to take a royalty on the first edition. The unauthorized reprints that followed paid him nothing at all. What money he did receive from authorized sales he donated. He used the profits to purchase mittens and supplies for Washington's soldiers, who were marching through a New Jersey winter with inadequate equipment and no certainty that they would survive the season. This was not a small gesture from a comfortable man. Paine had arrived in Philadelphia 2 years earlier with almost no money, no connections beyond Franklin's letter, no obvious reason for anyone to take him seriously. He gave away the proceeds of the most successful pamphlet in colonial American history to keep an army in the field. Consider what that means in terms of where he had started. In 1774, Thomas Paine was a recently sacked English tax collector, 37 years old, with a string of failed occupations behind him and a letter from Benjamin Franklin he was hoping might be worth something. In early 1776, he was almost certainly the most widely read author in the colonies, a man whose words were being quoted by generals and debated in the Continental Congress, whose arguments had done more to shift the political conversation toward independence than any official document produced by any governmental body. He had no title, no office, no military rank. He had a pen and an unusual ability to make radical ideas sound like the plainest common sense. The man who had spent decades failing at every trade he attempted had, in 47 pages, done more to change the political direction of a continent than any legislative body had managed in years. The summer of 1776 gave way to the worst autumn of the Revolution. Common sense had given the colonies a vision. The Continental Army was now tasked with defending it, and it was losing. British forces had driven Washington out of New York by September. By November, they had taken Fort Washington and Fort Lee. Nearly 3,000 American soldiers were captured in a single engagement. The army that had begun the year full of revolutionary energy was retreating through New Jersey in the rain, bleeding men with every mile. Enlistments expired, and soldiers simply walked home. Desertion was rampant. The cause that Paine's pamphlet had made feel inevitable was starting to look like a fantasy. Paine had enlisted as a volunteer aide to General Nathaniel Greene in September 1776. He was not a soldier by any meaningful definition. He couldn't march well, couldn't drill, wasn't built for the physical punishment of a campaign in the field. But he was there. He watched the retreat firsthand. He saw what the men looked like, ragged, hungry, their boots worn through, their faith in the enterprise visibly draining out of them with each day's withdrawal. He understood something important. The army didn't just need supplies and reinforcements. It needed a reason to believe the thing was still possible. So he wrote. Sitting by firelight during the retreat through New Jersey, Paine began drafting what would become the first of the American Crisis Papers. It was published on December 19, 1776. Washington's army was camped along the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. The enlistments of most of his men would expire on January 1st. If something didn't change before then, the Continental Army would simply cease to exist. The opening line of what Paine wrote has been quoted so many times since that it barely registers as the cry it actually was. These are the times that try men's souls, he went on. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Washington ordered the paper read aloud to every regiment before the crossing of the Delaware on December 25th. The crossing happened. The Battle of Trenton followed. Washington's army captured nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers in a victory that was as much psychological as military. The cause had found its footing again, and Paine's words were part of the reason why. How much can a piece of writing actually change a military situation? That question is worth sitting with. Washington clearly believed the answer was considerably. The crisis papers kept arriving throughout the war, 16 of them in total, each signed with the name that had become synonymous with revolutionary argument, common sense. They addressed soldiers, civilians, merchants who were growing tired of the disruptions to trade, and men in positions of power who were beginning to calculate whether accommodation with Britain might be the more rational choice. Paine attacked that logic every time it appeared. He named loyalists and fence-sitters directly. He explained British strategy in terms that stripped away any illusion of mercy or moderation. He was relentless. The second crisis paper appeared in January 1777, responding to British claims that the rebellion was nearly finished. The third came in April. Each one tracked the actual situation of the war and then worked to reframe it, not dishonestly, but insistently. A defeat was a delay. A British advance was an overextension. Paine was doing something generals couldn't do from a battlefield. He was managing the narrative of the war for everyone who wasn't fighting it, but whose continued support made fighting it possible. He also did something more direct. When he saw how the troops lived, the frostbitten feet, the inadequate food, the months without pay, he took $500 from his own salary and contributed it to a public subscription for the relief of soldiers. This wasn't a symbolic gesture from a wealthy man. Paine had very little money. He had given away the profits from common sense to purchase winter supplies for the army earlier. He seems to have understood, in a way that not everyone around him did, that ideas were useless if the men carrying muskets were starving. The crisis papers ran until April 1783, when the final one appeared following the Treaty of Paris. By then the cause had won. The last paper's tone is noticeably different from the first, quieter, more reflective, a man watching something he helped begin actually reach its conclusion. 13 years had passed since Paine first arrived in Philadelphia, barely able to stand. 7 years had passed since he sat down in the middle of a military retreat and started explaining to an exhausted army why the thing they were doing still mattered. The war was over. The country existed. The man who had done as much as anyone to put words to both the possibility and the necessity of it stood at the end of it with no official recognition, no pension, and no formal place in the nation he had helped argue into existence. He had written 16 pamphlets across 7 years of war, and almost every one of them arrived at exactly the moment the cause most needed to hear that it hadn't already lost. For 7 years, through every disaster and reversal, Paine kept writing, and for 7 years, soldiers and civilians alike kept reading. Once the shooting started, Paine found that governments needed him less than armies had. Congress appointed him secretary to the Committee on Foreign Affairs in 1777, which was, on the surface, a significant step up. He had a title. He had a government position. For a man who had arrived in Philadelphia 3 years earlier with nothing but a letter from Benjamin Franklin, it represented a kind of arrival. But Paine being Paine, he managed to turn the opportunity into a catastrophe within 2 years. The trouble centered on Silas Deane. Deane was an American diplomat who had been sent to France in 1776 to negotiate secretly for French support, weapons, money, supplies. He succeeded in that mission, at least in part. But Paine became convinced that Deane was also using the arrangement to enrich himself, taking private commissions on the aid that was supposed to be flowing freely to the Continental Army. Paine went public with the accusation. He published what he knew. The problem was that what he knew because of his position, and some of it was information Congress considered confidential. He had exposed a diplomat using intelligence he had access to only because Congress trusted him with it. The fallout was immediate. Congress was furious. Deane's supporters, who were numerous and well-connected, demanded Paine's resignation. He submitted it in January 1779. The Deane affair dragged on for years without resolution, and historians still debate how guilty Deane actually was. What isn't debated is that Paine sacrificed his first real government post to say publicly what he believed was true, and that Congress chose to protect its own embarrassment over the substance of his accusation. He was left again without income. Pennsylvania's government gave him a clerkship to the state assembly, which kept him solvent, but barely. What occupied him more seriously during these years was the question of what the revolution was actually building. Writing pamphlets was one thing. Translating those principles into actual governing documents was another. Paine worked alongside Philadelphia radicals to help shape Pennsylvania's new state constitution, one of the most democratic produced anywhere during the Revolutionary period. Property qualifications for voting were abolished. The right to participate in government was extended further down the social scale than almost any comparable document of the era. It was unglamorous work compared to common sense, largely invisible to history, but it was the kind of work that determined whether the revolution's language meant anything in practice. By 1781, the war had ground into a different phase. The French alliance, which Dean had helped arrange, and Paine had helped nearly blow apart with his accusations, was proving essential. Washington's army needed more from France, not just political support, but hard currency, ammunition, and supplies in quantities that letters of appeal were not securing. Congress sent John Lawrence to Paris to negotiate directly, and Paine went with him. Why Paine? He knew France, he knew the arguments, and he could write. The mission succeeded. The money and material they brought back contributed to the campaign that ended at Yorktown. Cornwallis surrendered in October 1781. The fighting for practical purposes was over. The peace treaty came in 1783. The country Paine had helped talk into existence was now formally recognised by Britain, and Paine's reward for all of it was essentially nothing. No pension from Congress, no land grant of the kind awarded to officers as a matter of course. No formal acknowledgement that the man who had written Common Sense, who had sustained the cause through 16 crisis papers, who had spent his own money to feed soldiers, had done anything deserving of official gratitude. New York State, acting on its own, gave him a small farm in New Rochelle that had been confiscated from a loyalist. It was a gesture, and a modest one. He accepted it. But Congress, the body he had served as a secretary, whose independence he had arguably done more than any single writer to make imaginable, decided that his contributions didn't warrant the kind of recognition granted to men who had done considerably less. The contrast was not lost on Paine, and it wasn't lost on the people around him who understood what the pamphlets had actually meant to the cause. It was the first version of a rejection that would repeat itself in increasingly painful forms for the rest of his life. The revolution he had helped start was over. The country he had helped create was indifferent to him, and he was already thinking about going back to Europe. Most people forget that Thomas Paine spent years trying to build a bridge. By 1787, the revolution was over. The treaties were signed. The army had dissolved. And the man whose words had arguably done more than any single pamphlet to make independence feel possible, found himself with no particular role in the country he had helped create. Congress had given him nothing. No pension, no official position, no formal recognition. New York State had handed him a small farm in New Rochelle, seized from a loyalist, and that was essentially it. So Paine turned to something he had been thinking about for years. Not politics, not philosophy, an iron bridge. The design had come to him while he was still in America, and it was genuinely ambitious. A single-span iron arch long enough to cross the Schuylkill River near Philadelphia without any supporting piers in the water. This mattered for practical reasons. Rivers in the American Northeast froze hard in winter and thawed violently in spring. Ice flows destroyed conventional bridge supports regularly. A single span, Paine argued, would eliminate the problem entirely. He had sketched the design, worked through the engineering, and built a small model out of wood and iron to demonstrate the principle. What he needed was money to build it. He approached potential backers in Pennsylvania and got nowhere. The project was too unconventional. The costs were too uncertain. Nobody wanted to fund an invention by a political pamphleteer with no engineering credentials. This is the part of Paine that tends to get lost. He was not simply a writer who stumbled into revolution. He was genuinely curious about how things worked, about materials and forces and the practical problems of construction. He had developed a smokeless candle before the bridge. He had experimented with wheel designs. He read scientific papers seriously and corresponded with men who were doing real work in natural philosophy. When he arrived in France in April 1787, he went not to meet politicians but to show his bridge model to the Académie des Sciences. They examined it carefully and reported back that the design was sound. This was not a trivial endorsement. The Académie was among the most rigorous scientific bodies in the world. From France he crossed to England, where he had not set foot for 13 years. He moved between London and the north, pursuing investors, talking to engineers, showing the model wherever he could get an audience. He met with ironmasters in Yorkshire who were interested enough to test the design seriously. A trial segment of the bridge was actually constructed at our ironworks in Rotherham. It held. The engineering worked. For a period of roughly 2 years, it genuinely looked as though Thomas Paine was going to be remembered not as the author of Common Sense, but as the man who designed a new kind of bridge. He was also, during these years, moving through intellectual circles that stretched across both countries. He spent time with Benjamin Franklin, who was then back in Philadelphia, but whose network of contacts throughout Europe remained intact. He knew scientists, philosophers, and reformers on both sides of the Channel. He was 50 years old, something of a celebrity in certain rooms, and apparently content, or close to it, to let the political part of his life recede. The bridge was consuming his energy. The funding remained elusive, but the technical problem was essentially solved, and he believed the money would eventually come. Then 1789 arrived. Paris erupted. The Bastille fell in July. The French monarchy began its long, violent collapse. Paine watched from England with the particular intensity of someone who had already lived through one revolution and recognized the shape of what was happening. He was not surprised. He had seen the financial exhaustion of the French state, the fury of ordinary people ground down by taxation and hunger, the complete inability of the aristocracy to read what was directly in front of them. What was happening in France looked to him like what had happened in America, only larger, older, and far more dangerous. Edmund Burke saw it differently. Burke, who had actually supported the American Revolution, published his Reflections on the Revolution in France in November 1790, and it was a thunderous rejection of everything Paine believed. Burke argued that the French were destroying a civilization their ancestors had built, that tradition and inherited institutions embodied wisdom that abstract reason could never replace, that tearing down the old order was not liberation, but catastrophe. The book was eloquent. It was widely read. And for Paine, sitting in England with his bridge design spread across the table, it was intolerable. Edmund Burke had attacked the French Revolution with the full weight of conservative tradition behind him, and Paine, reading the Reflections, felt the familiar old anger rising and went to his desk. The Rights of Man was a different kind of book from anything Paine had written before, longer, denser, more comprehensive, considerably more dangerous to its author. Common Sense had been 47 pages. The American Crisis Papers were dispatches urgent and short, written to be read aloud before a battle. Rights of Man was 90,000 words of sustained political argument. Paine knew when he sat down to write it that he was building something different in kind, not just in length. Edmund Burke had given him the target. Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in November 1790, was a defense of tradition, of inherited institutions, of the idea that a civilization accumulates wisdom across generations, and that tearing it down in the name of abstract principles is the act of children who don't understand what their parents built. It was elegantly argued, widely read, and in Paine's view, completely wrong. He began writing his response almost immediately. Part 1 appeared in March 1791. It was a direct dismantling of Burke's position, point by point, with the same clarity Paine had used in Common Sense, but now sharpened by years of political experience on 2 continents. Burke had argued that the English Revolution of 1688 had bound all future generations to its settlement, that the people of 1688 had made a permanent contract on behalf of every English person who would ever live. Paine found this argument not just wrong but absurd. The living, he wrote, could not be governed by the dead. Each generation was born free, with the same rights as the generation before it. No parliament, no king, no founding document had the authority to strip those rights away permanently. Constitutions belonged to the living. That was the only thing that made them legitimate. He defended the French Revolution against Burke's horror at its violence and disorder. France had dismantled a system built on privilege and cruelty, Paine argued. The chaos that followed was inseparable from the centuries of oppression that had preceded it. What Burke called civilization, Paine called a machine for keeping the many poor so that the few could stay rich. The titles, the ceremonies, the elaborate deference, none of it was wisdom accumulated by history. It was a con perpetuated by those who benefited from it, dressed up in the language of tradition to make it seem inevitable. Part 2, published in February 1792, went somewhere else entirely. The rebuttal of Burke was the opening act. What Paine built in the second part was something that had no precedent in political writing, a comprehensive programme for social reform, specific enough to be implemented, funded, and administered. This was not philosophy, it was policy. Paine proposed universal and free education for children of the poor, funded by the state. He proposed old age pensions for men and women over 50, graduated by age. He proposed family allowances, payments to parents for each child, to prevent poverty from compounding across generations. He proposed a progressive income tax, where larger incomes paid proportionally more. He costed all of it, worked through the arithmetic, showed that England's existing tax revenues, redirected away from war and aristocratic subsidy, could fund every one of these programs without difficulty. How does a man who spent his life financially ruined come up with a blueprint for the welfare state? The answer is probably that he knew what poverty looked like from the inside. He had been an excise officer, watching families destroyed by tax burdens they couldn't carry. He had been a failed craftsman who understood exactly what it meant to have no cushion, no pension, no recourse when things went wrong. The programme in Rights of Man Part 2 wasn't abstract theorising. It was the policy answer to problems Paine had watched real people suffer through for 30 years. The book sold approximately 1 million copies across Britain and Europe. It was read aloud in inns and coffee houses across the industrial north of England, passed from hand to hand among workers who had never encountered a political text that addressed their actual lives. Every other political writer of the era was writing for the educated classes, lawyers, landowners, men with university educations who could navigate classical references and formal argument. Paine wrote for the printer's apprentice and the factory hand in direct sentences that didn't require a dictionary. The reception in working-class communities was overwhelming. These readers recognized something. They recognized a writer who was angry about what they were angry about, who saw the system they lived under as the constructed thing it was, rather than the natural order it claimed to be. The British government recognized it too and was not pleased. Within months of Part 2's publication, the authorities were moving against the book. Magistrates across England issued orders suppressing it. Loyalist groups organised public burnings. The government understood, correctly, that a book explaining to working people that their poverty was a political choice rather than a fact of nature was considerably more dangerous than a book arguing about the French Revolution. Burke had been arguing about history and principle. Paine was giving people a reason to question everything about the society they lived in, including the men who ran it. William Godwin and Thomas Holcroft had helped bring the book into print. Godwin observed that the seeds of revolution it contained were too vigorous to be suppressed by any government. He wasn't wrong about the seeds. He was somewhat optimistic about the suppression. The British state had long experience dealing with inconvenient writers, and it moved against Paine with efficiency. A warrant was issued for his arrest on a charge of seditious libel. The trial was scheduled. Paine's allies urged him to leave England immediately. By the time the trial took place, in December 1792, Paine was already in France. He had left in September, crossing the Channel in the company of other radicals fleeing government attention, stepping off English soil for the last time in his life. The verdict was delivered in his absence. He was found guilty, declared an outlaw in Britain, and his book was banned. Neither the conviction nor the ban prevented Rights of Man from continuing to circulate. Banned books have a way of spreading. This one had already spread far enough that no court order could pull it back. Universal free education, old age pensions, family allowances, progressive taxation, none of these existed in Britain in 1792. All of them would, eventually. Free universal education arrived in 1944. Old age pensions and family allowances for all as a right came in 1947. Paine had proposed them 150 years earlier, in a book the government tried to suppress. Written by a man they were trying to prosecute. The British government charged Paine with seditious libel. Paine, who had seen enough of English courts to know how this would go, was already in France by the time the verdict came in. France in 1792 received Thomas Paine as a revolutionary celebrity, and France in 1793 nearly killed him. He had fled England in September 1792 with the seditious libel conviction effectively certain. The British government had charged him over Rights of Man, and Paine understood what English courts did to men they wanted silenced. He crossed the Channel and arrived in Calais to crowds lining the streets. Soldiers saluted him. Women handed him flowers. 3 separate departments, the Oise, the Pas-de-Calais, and the Puy-de-Dôme, had each elected him to the National Convention, the revolutionary body governing France. A failed corset maker from Norfolk had become, in the space of 16 years, a figure of international revolutionary authority. There was one significant problem. Paine spoke almost no French. He had spent enough time in the country to navigate a meal or a transaction, but certainly not enough to debate constitutional theory in a body of several hundred men whose arguments moved fast and whose factions were already sharpening into something dangerous. His speeches had to be written in English, translated, and read aloud by someone else, while Paine sat and listened to words that were, technically, his own delivered in a language he couldn't follow. It was a strange situation for a man whose entire power came from his ability to speak directly to people. For the first time in his political life, the words and the voice were separated. He aligned himself with the Girondins. They were the moderate faction within the convention, committed to the revolution, but cautious about where it was heading, more inclined toward constitutional order than mass violence. Paine shared their instincts. He believed in republics built on law, not on terror. He had watched in America what happened when revolutionary energy was channeled into institutions rather than consumed by internal purges. The Girondins seemed to understand this. Their opponents, the Montagnards, did not. Then came the question of Louis XVI. The king had been arrested, tried, and found guilty of treason against the French people by the autumn of 1792. The verdict was never seriously in doubt. What remained to be decided was the sentence. Most of the convention favoured execution. Paine stood up, or rather, his translated words stood up, and argued against it. His reasoning was careful, and he believed strategically sound. He had no love for monarchy. He had spent 20 years arguing that hereditary kingship was an absurdity and an offence against human reason. But killing Louis would hand every European monarch a martyr and a justification for war against France. It would signal that the revolution operated on the same logic as the despotism it claimed to replace. Paine proposed exile to America instead. Let the former king live out his days across the ocean, harmless and forgotten. The Montagnards were not persuaded. Several of them questioned Paine's motives openly on the floor. One suggested that a Quaker upbringing had made him squeamish about blood, which was both inaccurate and politically useful as an insult. Paine was not a Quaker, but the label stuck to him anyway. the vote went against him. Louis XVI was guillotined on January 21st, 1793. Paine had lost the argument, and in losing it, he had made himself visible to the wrong people. What followed in the next months was one of the most rapid political collapses in revolutionary history. The Girondins, already weakened, found themselves outmaneuvered by the Montagnards and their allies in the Paris streets. In June 1793, the Montagnards essentially expelled the Girondin leadership from the convention. Several were arrested, others fled. The political faction that Paine had publicly associated himself with was now either imprisoned or in hiding, and the men who had regarded the Girondins as enemies were now in full control of the French government. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety moved with extraordinary speed to consolidate that control. The terror that followed was not a slow escalation. It accelerated almost immediately. Arrests came nightly. The revolutionary tribunals worked quickly and found almost everyone guilty. The guillotine in the Place de la Révolution ran through dozens of people a week, then more. Paine watched this from inside Paris, increasingly isolated, increasingly aware that his own position was precarious. Friends he had known since arriving in France disappeared into prison. Some came out the other side, most did not. The principles that had animated 1789, liberty, equality, the rights of man, the very phrase he had used as the title of his book, were being spoken by the same mouths that were ordering executions. How does a revolution that began with declarations of universal rights end up consuming the people who believed in them? Paine had no satisfying answer. He had written about what republics ought to be. He had not fully accounted for what they could become when fear took hold and factional logic replaced principle. He was also, by the end of 1793, a man without real protection. His American citizenship was ambiguous. His Girondin associations were documented. His vote against executing the king was on the record for anyone who wanted to use it against him. He had argued against executing a king on grounds of principle, and the men who wanted to execute kings were now deciding whether to execute him. Thomas Paine was arrested on December 28, 1793, in the middle of the night, walked into the Luxembourg prison with no certainty that he would ever walk out. The Luxembourg had been a palace once. By the winter of 1793, it was something else entirely, a holding pen for people the Committee of General Security had decided were enemies of the Republic. Priests, aristocrats, foreign nationals, Girondin sympathizers. Now Thomas Paine, the man who had crossed an ocean to help France understand what revolution was supposed to mean. The irony was not subtle. The author of Rights of Man was imprisoned by men who claimed to be enacting those same rights, in a building that had housed royalty, surrounded by the very people the revolution had sworn to destroy. He was 66 years old, he was sick, and he was entirely alone. The conditions inside the Luxembourg were designed, whether intentionally or not, to break people before the guillotine got to them. Disease moved through the crowded cells, the way it always moves through places where frightened people are packed too close together. Dysentery, fever, infections that had no treatment and no mercy. Prisoners disappeared daily, summoned, walked out, and never returned. The sound of the carts in the morning became something you learned not to listen for. Paine had survived debt, exile, the Atlantic in November, 11 months of revolutionary Paris. None of it had prepared him for this. Within weeks of his imprisonment, he developed a fever so severe that the prison guards moved him to a larger cell with other men. The door opened during the day to let air circulate. He lay in that cell through the early months of 1794, sweating through what his body could barely withstand, while the terror outside the prison walls reached its highest and most frantic pitch. How close did he come? The answer is close enough that it became one of those stories that sounds invented, but wasn't. The process for selecting prisoners for the guillotine was bureaucratic in the way that the terror was bureaucratic about everything. Efficient, impersonal, almost administrative. Guards would move through the prison and mark the doors of cells whose occupants were scheduled for execution, drawing a chalk mark on the outside of each door. That evening, the marked prisoners would be collected. On the night Paine's cell was marked, his door was open. The chalk went on the inside of the door. When the door was closed at nightfall, the mark faced the wall. The guards came through, saw no mark, and moved on. Paine, unconscious with fever, never knew it had happened. He woke the next morning still alive, with no idea how narrow the margin had been. Days passed, then weeks. Robespierre's grip on the Committee of Public Safety was not as secure as it appeared from the outside. The men around him had begun to calculate that his particular version of revolutionary virtue was as likely to kill them as anyone else. On July 27, 1794, 9 Thermidor by the revolutionary calendar, the convention turned on him. Robespierre was arrested, tried in a matter of hours, and guillotined the following day. The terror ended, or at least changed character. The executions slowed. The prison population began, tentatively, to hope. Paine was not released immediately. He remained in the Luxembourg through the autumn of 1794, still ill, still without any clarity about what was going to happen to him. James Monroe had arrived in Paris as the new American minister to France, replacing Gouverneur Morris, who had been conspicuously indifferent to Paine's situation. Monroe was different. He formally claimed Paine as an American citizen, argued his case directly with French authorities. On November 4, 1794, Thomas Paine walked out of the Luxembourg prison after 10 months and 7 days inside it. He was not the same man who had gone in. The fever had left him physically diminished in ways that would never fully resolve. An abscess on his side from the illness continued to trouble him for years afterward. But the physical damage, real as it was almost secondary to what the imprisonment had done to his understanding of the world and his place in it. He had gone into the Luxembourg as a man betrayed by revolutionary politics. He came out convinced he had also been betrayed by a specific person. George Washington had been president throughout Paine's imprisonment. Washington had known where Paine was. The French government's hostility to Paine was, at least in part, a function of British pressure. The British had made clear that an American intervention on Paine's behalf would complicate diplomatic relations at a delicate moment. Washington, facing the challenge of establishing a new nation that needed to manage its relationships with every major European power, had chosen not to intervene. Whether this was a calculated sacrifice or simply a political judgment that one man's imprisonment didn't outweigh larger diplomatic interests depends on how charitably you read the situation. Paine did not read it charitably. He read it as abandonment. He read it as cowardice. He read it, eventually, as something close to betrayal of everything they had both once believed about what America was supposed to be. The letter Paine eventually wrote to Washington was savage in a way that few documents in American political history can match. A long, methodical dismantling of a man's character and political record, written by someone who had helped create the circumstances that made Washington possible. Whether Paine was right about Washington's motives is a question historians have argued ever since. What isn't in question is what the experience cost him. He had helped light the fuse of American independence. He had watched France attempt its own version of the same experiment and nearly died inside it. He was alive, barely, convinced that the man he had done more than almost anyone to put in power had simply chosen not to save him. The Age of Reason was the book that finished Thomas Paine's reputation in America, which makes it worth understanding what he was actually arguing. He began writing it in prison. The Luxembourg was not a place that encouraged optimism about human institutions, and Paine had watched the terror turn a revolution built on Enlightenment principles into something that looked more like a religious purge running in reverse. Churches were being closed. Priests were being executed. The official position of the French Republic was trending toward the elimination of God entirely. Paine thought this was a catastrophe in the making. He did not want to save Christianity. He wanted to save something he considered more important: the idea that God existed and that human reason was the instrument for understanding that fact. So he wrote. The book appeared in 3 parts: 1794, 1795, and 1807. The first part was completed while he was still in the Luxembourg, passed to a friend before his arrest deepened. He wrote it quickly, without access to a Bible, which is both remarkable and telling. He knew the text well enough from memory to argue with it in detail. The argument he was making was not atheism. He stated his position plainly at the outset. He believed in one God. He hoped for happiness beyond this life. What he did not believe in was any church, any priest, any scripture claiming to be the direct word of a creator. What exactly was wrong with scripture? Paine had a specific answer. Revelation, he argued, is only valid for the person who receives it. If God speaks directly to a man in the desert, that is a genuine revelation for that man. The moment he tells someone else, it stops being revelation and becomes hearsay. Every person down the chain is being asked to accept a second-hand account as divine truth, and there is no rational basis for doing so. The entire apparatus of organized Christianity rested, in Paine's view, on demanding that billions of people treat hearsay as sacred fact. He found this not just intellectually dishonest, but deliberately exploitative. Churches needed people to accept the authority of Scripture, because the authority of Scripture was what gave churches their power. He went further. The Bible itself, subjected to ordinary scrutiny, was full of problems. Dates that didn't align, events described by authors who couldn't have witnessed them, stories that contradicted each other across books, miracles that could not be verified by any standard of evidence that people applied to anything else in their lives. Paine pointed these out methodically, without rage, which somehow made it worse for his critics. He wasn't ranting, he was reasoning. He walked through Genesis, through the Gospels, through the epistles, asking the same basic question at each turn: what is the actual evidence for this claim? The answer, repeatedly, was that there was none beyond the document itself, asserting that it was true. What did Paine believe instead? He was a deist. God, in his view, was the architect of the natural world, the intelligence behind the laws of physics, the order of the planets, the design visible in the structure of living things. This God was real and discoverable, but not through priests or councils or ancient texts. You found this God through science, through mathematics, through the study of nature as it actually existed. The universe was the scripture. Everything else was a human document with human errors and human agendas embedded throughout. He was particularly sharp about the economic dimension. Churches, he noted, had spent centuries accumulating land, wealth, and political power. The mechanism for doing this was maintaining a monopoly on the interpretation of texts that lay people were told they couldn't properly understand without clerical guidance. Strip away the mysticism, let people read and reason for themselves, and the institutional church lost its justification for existing. Paine thought this was precisely why churches fought so hard against literacy and rational inquiry. The business model depended on dependence. The reaction in Britain was sharp, but the reaction in America was ferocious. Britain prosecuted him for seditious libel over the rights of man. That was political. The age of reason hit something deeper. American evangelical Christianity in the 1790s and early 1800s was experiencing revival movements, a surge of emotional and doctrinal intensity. Into this atmosphere arrived a book that called the Bible a human document, described miracles as unverifiable stories, and suggested that every church in the world was essentially a protection racket dressed in theological language. Ministers read passages aloud from the pulpit as evidence of Paine's corruption. Federalist newspapers printed columns treating him as an agent of Satan. The word atheist attached itself to him like a brand, and it never came off, despite the fact that the very first sentence of the book explicitly rejected atheism. He went through 17 American editions in just a few years. People were reading it, which was almost the problem. It was accessible in exactly the way common sense had been accessible. No Latin, no dense theological apparatus, just a man asking ordinary questions in ordinary language about claims that had never been subjected to ordinary scrutiny. The audience understood it immediately, and a significant portion of the audience was genuinely shaken. Paine had spent his career making dangerous ideas feel like common sense. This time, the idea felt too dangerous. He had written a defense of God against organized religion, and half of Christendom read it as an attack on God entirely, which tells you something both about the book and about how frightened people were of what it implied. Thomas Paine arrived back in America in October 1802 after 15 years in Europe, and discovered that the country he had helped create wanted nothing to do with him. Jefferson had made contact. He was the one president still willing to acknowledge Paine publicly, and he had offered some encouragement for the return. But Jefferson's support had limits, and Paine was about to discover exactly where those limits were. The America of 1802 was not the America of 1776. The revolutionary generation was aging. The fever had cooled. What the country wanted now was stability, respectability, and a church on every corner. And Thomas Paine represented the opposite of all three. The age of reason had done its damage thoroughly. Churches across the country had spent 8 years preaching against him. Ministers who had never read the book denounced it anyway. Federalist newspapers, which had despised Paine since his attack on Washington, now had fresh material, and they used it without restraint. He was called an atheist, a drunk, a traitor, a filthy infidel. Some of this was politics dressed up as religion. Much of it was genuine outrage from people who believed he had attacked the foundations of Christian civilization. The distinction hardly mattered. By the time his ship reached Baltimore, the verdict on Thomas Paine had already been delivered. He traveled to Washington and visited Jefferson at the White House. Jefferson received him warmly in private, but Jefferson was a president in the middle of a delicate political moment, and being seen as the patron of America's most hated infidel was not something he could afford. The warm private meetings did not translate into any public support. No appointment came, no formal recognition, no gesture toward the decades of service Paine had rendered to the revolutionary cause. Jefferson admired him genuinely. That much seems clear from their correspondence. But admiration expressed only behind closed doors is a particular kind of abandonment, and Paine understood it for exactly what it was. He tried to settle in New Rochelle, where New York State had given him a small farm years earlier. It was not a comfortable existence. His health was deteriorating. The fever from his Luxembourg imprisonment had never fully released its hold on him, and he had added years of difficult living on top of the damage already done. He drank more than was good for him. He was not always easy company. When he attempted to vote in the 1806 local election in New Rochelle, the election supervisor turned him away. His citizenship, the man claimed, was in dispute. Paine had been born in England, had become an American, had been made a French citizen by the National Convention, and had spent a year in a French prison, in part because the American government had declined to claim him. Now that same government's local representative was telling him he couldn't vote. He was 69 years old and had been writing about the rights of citizens since before most of the people in that room were born. He wrote letters of protest. He wrote political essays. He was occasionally published, occasionally read, mostly ignored. The voice that had once moved a continent to action was now a minor annoyance in the margins of a country that had moved on. He sought a government pension for his service during the Revolution, his writing, his work as Foreign Affairs Secretary, his mission to France with John Lawrence in 1781 to secure the aid that helped end the war. The request went nowhere. Congress did not vote on it. Nobody wanted to be recorded as the legislator who stood up to defend Thomas Paine. He moved between New Rochelle and New York City as his circumstances shifted and his health declined. In the city, he was occasionally recognised and occasionally abused for it. There are accounts of him being spat upon, of innkeepers who knew who he was and refused to give him a room. The man who had written that all men were created equal and that governments derived their authority from the consent of the governed was being turned out of boarding houses by men who had almost certainly absorbed those ideas without ever tracing them back to their source. This was the particular cruelty of his final years. The ideas had travelled everywhere. The man was welcome almost nowhere. Jefferson's quiet distance held. They corresponded, but Jefferson was careful about what he put in writing and more careful about what he did in public. The friendship was real enough, but it was a friendship that had to stay hidden, which made it less a friendship than a private acknowledgement of a debt no one intended to pay. The man who had once been celebrated in every colonial tavern, from Boston to Charleston, spent his final years being refused service in New York City inns that didn't want the trouble of his company. Thomas Paine died on the morning of June 8th, 1809, in a rented room on Grove Street in Greenwich Village, and the funeral 6 days later was attended by 6 people. He was 72 years old. The man who had once sold 500,000 copies of a single pamphlet, whose words George Washington ordered read to a freezing army on the banks of the Delaware, died in rented rooms with almost no one who knew his name willing to stand beside him. The final years had been grinding. He had suffered at least 2 strokes by 1806, leaving him partially paralysed. His hands shook. His body, never particularly strong even in his prime, had been further weakened by the fever he'd contracted in the Luxembourg prison more than a decade earlier, and it never fully recovered. He moved between a house in New Rochelle and rented rooms in New York City, dependent on the charity of a shrinking circle of supporters. He drank more than was good for him. He wrote occasional political pieces, but the country had stopped listening. He applied for a government pension, recognizing his service during the Revolution. Congress refused. The man who had donated his own money to buy supplies for Washington's troops was told in effect that the ledger was settled. His mind stayed sharp, even as his body collapsed. He kept reading, kept arguing, kept writing letters that editors largely declined to publish. What he couldn't do was make people care. The churches had been denouncing him for 15 years. The Federalist press had turned his name into a synonym for godlessness and moral disorder. To be seen with Thomas Paine in 1807 or 1808 was a liability most people weren't willing to accept. He had outlived his usefulness to a country that preferred not to remember how it had actually come to exist. When he died, the question of where to bury him became its own small drama. Paine had asked to be buried in the Quaker graveyard. The Quakers refused. He had spent 30 years arguing that organised religion was a mechanism of control dressed up as revelation, and the Quakers, whatever their reputation for tolerance, were not inclined to offer their graveyard to the man who had written The Age of Reason. He was buried instead on his farm in New Rochelle, in a modest grave with 6 people in attendance. No ceremony, no tributes from Congress, no acknowledgement from the government of the country whose founding he had done so much to make possible. That should have been the end of it. But Thomas Paine's story had one more chapter left, and it was stranger than almost anything in his actual life. William Cobbett was an English radical journalist who had spent years attacking Paine in print, calling him every name available to a writer of genuine venom. Then Cobbett read him carefully. Then Cobbett changed his mind entirely, not gradually, but all at once, with the totality of conversion. By 1819, Cobbett had decided that Thomas Paine deserved a memorial worthy of his actual importance, and that England, not America, was where that memorial should stand. So Cobbett went to New Rochelle. He dug up the bones, He put them in a box and shipped them across the Atlantic, announcing that he would raise funds for a grand tomb, that Britain would honour the man America had discarded. The plan collapsed. Cobbett couldn't raise the money. The public in England, whatever sympathy existed for Paine's politics, was not prepared to fund monuments to him. The bones sat in Cobbett's possession, neither buried nor displayed, a problem he kept meaning to solve. Then Cobbett died in 1835, 16 years after he'd dug Paine up, and the bones passed into the chaos of estate administration. They were inventoried, then they disappeared. Historians have traced them this far and no further. They passed through at least 2 or 3 sets of hands in the years after Cobbett's death, and then the trail simply ends. No grave, no monument, no location. To this day, nobody knows where Thomas Paine's bones are, which is, depending on how you look at it, either a fitting symbol of how thoroughly his own country rejected him, or simply one of history's more absurd administrative failures. The ideas Thomas Paine put into the world did not die with him, even if everything else about him seemed to. He died with 6 people at his funeral and no country willing to claim him. His bones were eventually dug up, shipped across the Atlantic, and lost. And yet the arguments he made about monarchy, about poverty, about who government is actually for, kept moving through history long after the man himself had been buried, unburied, and misplaced. The resurrections came in waves. The labour movement of the 19th century found in Paine something that most founding fathers conspicuously lacked: a genuine conviction that the poverty of working people was not a natural condition, but a manufactured one. Rights of Man had said it plainly. Inequality wasn't inevitable. It was a policy choice made by people who benefited from it. That argument landed differently in the factory towns of northern England than it did in the drawing rooms of Philadelphia. The workers who read Paine in the 1830s and 1840s understood that he was talking about them in a way that almost no one else in the revolutionary tradition had bothered to do. The suffrage movement found him too. He had written in common sense that all men were originally equal. The women who took that seriously in the 19th century pointed out the obvious implications. Paine himself had not drawn those conclusions explicitly, but his logic led there whether he followed it or not. His insistence that inherited privilege had no rational foundation applied to sex as readily as to birth order. The movements that came after him were not shy about saying so. Abraham Lincoln kept a copy of The Age of Reason. That fact alone is worth sitting with. The president who led the country through its second great crisis was reading the book that had destroyed Paine's reputation, the one that got him denounced from pulpits across America, the one that Theodore Roosevelt later used to dismiss him as a filthy little atheist. Roosevelt said that in 1888. Paine was 5 feet 9 inches tall and a committed deist who had spent 30 years insisting he believed in God, just not in any church's version of God. The slander stuck anyway. It was more useful than the truth. The New Deal era discovered the welfare state proposals buried in Part 2 of Rights of Man and found them startlingly specific. Paine had not just gestured at the idea of helping the poor, he had costed it out. Old age pensions funded through progressive taxation, family allowances for children, universal free education, public works for the unemployed. He wrote those proposals in 1792. Britain didn't introduce universal free education until 1944. Old age pensions for all didn't come until 1947. The man was working roughly a century and a half ahead of the governments that eventually implemented what he had described. How does that happen? How does someone write proposals that specific, that detailed in 1792, have them dismissed as dangerous radicalism for 150 years before a different generation of politicians quietly puts them into law without mentioning where the idea came from? The answer probably has something to do with the fact that Paine was never respectable. He was too angry, too direct, too willing to say that the people at the top of the social order had arranged things for their own benefit and called it natural law. That kind of argument doesn't age well in polite company, even when the polite company eventually adopts the policies. In Britain, the Thomas Paine Society kept his memory alive through the decades when America had mostly chosen to forget him. There is a statue of him in Thetford, the Norfolk market town where he was born, the kind of place that produces no one of consequence, and then spends centuries being slightly surprised when it turns out it did. The Americans erected their own memorials eventually, but later, and with a certain residual awkwardness, as if they weren't quite sure how loudly they wanted to celebrate someone who had also called George Washington a traitor and spent his last years being turned away from polling stations. What Paine had argued, at the core of everything he wrote, was that government derived its authority from the living and owed nothing to the dead. Each generation had the right to remake its arrangements from scratch. The past had no claim on the present, except the claim that the present chose to honour. That idea frightened people in 1776, and it frightened people in 1792, and it has continued to frighten people at regular intervals ever since. This was because it removes the most powerful argument that any established order has, that things are the way they are because they have always been that way. Changing them would be unnatural. Paine's answer to that argument was simple. Nothing about the current arrangement is natural. Someone chose it, someone benefits from it, and someone else is paying for it without being asked whether they agree. That is not a complicated idea. It is, in fact, common sense, which may explain why the opening lines of the American Crisis are still quoted at political rallies, in speeches, in moments of national difficulty, by people who have no idea who wrote them. These are the times that try men's souls. Most of the people who reach for that sentence have never read a word of Paine, don't know he existed, would be surprised to learn that the man who wrote it died alone in a rented room in Greenwich Village with the country he helped create, refusing to acknowledge what it owed him. 3 centuries after a failed corset maker from Norfolk sat down to explain why kings had no right to exist. People still reach for his words when everything is going wrong, usually without knowing whose words they are. That is exactly the kind of immortality Paine would have found both fitting and infuriating.